And so I'm going to turn to Amira to see if she can provide us with an overview of what the threat landscape looks like in South Asia, not only with Islamic State Khorasan, but with other groups including TTP, the Pakistani Taliban, LEG, and some of the other kind of alphabet soup of terrorist and militant groups around Afghanistan, Pakistan, and broader South Asia.
Thank you all for being here. Really happy to be a part of this esteemed panel. I'm not going to be able to talk about all of the groups because I would need several days for that. So I'm going to just stick to giving you a few an overview and some highlights. So as we all think about new security challenges, and we would like to look at the future with some optimism, I think it's also a good moment to pause and reflect upon some of the hard lessons that we have learned about jihadist groups, especially in terms of how they adapt to changing situations in specific locations. And that in itself can tell us a lot about what may happen in the future. So in the context of South and Central Asia, specifically Afghanistan and Pakistan, which is my area of study, if you look at the region's history, right, armed violence has always been a part of the fabric of South Asia. And so, unfortunately, jihadist militancy in South Asia is unlikely to be eliminated anytime soon. However, we are lucky to have had a lot of good researchers work on the region, and we have a better understanding of the problem. So what we do know is that jihadist threats in South Asia have tended to ebb and flow in response to what's happening within states, what's happening between states, and what's happening on the global stage. So what we see today is a combination of local influence as well as what's happening internationally. So if we take a step back and take a more global perspective, right? There's three critical junctures which emerged temporally where we really saw that they shifted the nature of jihad in the region. So first, the nature of jihadism in the region was most notably, obviously, influenced by bin Laden's arrival there, the rise of Al-Qaeda, and of course the Russian invasion of Afghanistan in the 80s. Now around this time, in addition to transnational elements, we also began to see a rise in sectarian violence and proxy warfare. And we also had separatist movements in Pakistan in the background. Now, after 9/11, we all know it triggered a 20-year war on terror, during which we saw the landscape shift again in profound ways and countless ways. The most notable changes in this period included, well, the emergence of Islamic State and its affiliate in Afghanistan, Islamic State Khorasan. We also saw a sharp increase in anti-government militancy and terrorism against civilians, especially in Pakistan. And what we also saw was a deepening of interlinkages between groups, which especially seemed oriented to withstand the pressure of internationalized counterterrorism operations. So we saw groups like the Pakistani Taliban and Al-Qaeda work more closely with sectarian outfits just for tactical cooperation and also for mere survival. And now finally, we're in a new phase where not only has the US withdrawn, but a fairly ineffectual Taliban government is in place. Now, this has emboldened jihadists globally. I think we can all appreciate that. But in South Asia, the effect is even more pronounced because of the proximity of the jihadist victory and also the contributions of local groups to the battle with international forces in Afghanistan. So where does that leave us today? So essentially what we see is a very fragmented jihadist threat with at least 5 different types of groups existing in the region, which often overlap in their ideology and also in their targeting priorities, which makes it really blurry for governments to distinguish between them. But this includes state-linked groups such as Lashkar-e-Taiba, sectarian groups such as Lashkar-e-Jhangvi, you have separatist groups, then you have anti-government groups like the Pakistani Taliban, and finally you have transnational jihadists. And because of the presence of these multiple militant groups in close proximity with years of experience of innovation and adaptation, this, I think, from my view, has resulted in 2 defining characteristics of the South Asian jihadist landscape. So first of all, it's created a local jihadist infrastructure, which isn't a physical infrastructure, but it consists of logistical and tactical interlinkages. So the crux of the problem with this infrastructure is that it allows militants to regroup and reemerge post-CT operations, and it ultimately prolongs their survival. Another related outcome that we saw, especially after 9/11, was a deeper fusion of transnational elements and local groups, which has enabled networks of terror to operate in the region. So this is where militants don't just cooperate strategically, but also opportunistically for short-term gains. So I will not talk about specific groups, but I'm happy to do so in the Q&A, such as Islamic State Khorasan. That is one of the major threats. We have the Pakistani Taliban, which is experiencing a revival. And then we have groups like Al-Qaeda in the Indian subcontinent, which is sort of subdued like its parent organization, but is definitely operating in the background. So what can governments do to tackle these networks and extremist ideologies? That's a long conversation, right? But I think regional governments need to first acknowledge that there's a growing inclination of jihadists to work together regardless of their background and ideology. And that jihadism now is a fusion of transnational elements and locally oriented groups. So dealing with a jihadist movement that knows how to adapt requires regional governments to stay 2 steps ahead of it. A long-term security policy, instead of disjointed actions which target specific groups, hasn't really worked. So regional governments need to work together and come up with a long-term plan. But independently, at the state level, they also need to take rising extremism and polarization more seriously in order to make jihadist propaganda less appealing, or just reduce the vulnerability of civilians to jihadist coercion. Happen when the US would withdraw, and whether the Taliban were actually capable of conducting counterterrorism operations. And I think part of the confusion, which led many to believe that the Taliban would actually be able to suppress groups like ISK, but also distance themselves from the Pakistani Taliban, so their allies, that hasn't really played out as we all expected. So for one, ISK has actually tripled its attacks since the US withdrawal and the collapse of the Afghan government. And this surprised many, but those who were actually keeping an eye on ISK since its formation, we began to see this transition in 2020 when it sort of transformed from an insurgent group to more of a terrorist group. And that's what we're doing, that's what we're seeing right now. So ISK is actually growing in strength and its lethality. And it's essentially pursuing a 3-pronged strategy, right? So it's engaging in terrorism against not just civilians, but civil society organizations, as well as minorities. And this ultimately makes the Taliban look bad. They have also targeted Taliban leaders, ideologues, in an effort to show that they're not capable of conducting counterterrorism operations. And then finally, they have significantly expanded their propaganda output. But what's really interesting that if you look at their propaganda and also their recent attacks, which they have claimed, you can clearly see that they're attempting to become a regional organization. So within their propaganda, they're advertising the different nationalities of their attackers. And also what's really unique about ISK in that situation, that it's actively trying to subsume the agendas of all these minor groups that I mentioned earlier within their own agenda. And because their agenda is so vast that they won't stop unless they create a caliphate, it actually has that potential. So whether local groups actually buy into that ideology, that narrative, actually isn't really that relevant because it gives them a platform from where they can continue to wage their jihad from, especially because the Taliban now want to distance themselves from most terrorist groups, except for some where they may have historical links. But even then, on the surface, it's not that obvious anymore. So I think overall, we have Al-Qaeda's presence is still there. We have AQIS, and we've also seen that the Taliban have refused to actually constrain the Pakistani Taliban. So this was an expectation that the international community had, the number one condition. And we have seen the Taliban, either they're not willing to or they're not capable of. So the end result is ISK is growing in strength and is becoming a regional entity. And it, for the first time, it claimed attacks in Uzbekistan. It claimed an attack in Iran, in Tajikistan. So there are real concerns, which is why I was sort of suggesting that regional governments need to realize that this problem is not confined to any one country, right? This threat transcends national boundaries. So there's a need to come up with a coordinated plan, and even if it is kinetic, because these militants are connected and they move across borders with relative ease, and they also share a lot of their financial and recruitment pipelines, right? So no single country can actually tackle the jihadist threat as it exists now. And just one final point before, sorry, I got distracted with it. I guess the last point I want to make is that at the regional level, they need to coordinate, but at the individual level, because as I mentioned, local drivers are really important. So what's happening with the Pakistani Taliban isn't just linked to the war on terror. You can trace it back to the legacies of British colonial era. So it has to be a holistic approach, but also at the state levels, a lot of the countries need to move away from proxy warfare. It hasn't really paid off. So a new direction is definitely required. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's hard to believe, but we're already at the end of the panel. Like they say, time flies when you're having fun. And I certainly am getting to be up here with literally some of the top scholars in the world on these regions, on these groups. And so for those who didn't get enough here, I do urge you to come up and engage throughout the course of the rest of this conference with the panelists.